There is a moment that often goes unnoticed, not because it is small, but because it arrives without drama. Nothing explodes, no door slams, no final argument announces that something fundamental has shifted. What happens instead is quieter than that. You begin to feel less pulled, less reactive. The emotional gravity that once kept you orbiting someone else's moods starts to loosen. At first, you may mistake this for exhaustion, or numbness, or a phase you'll snap out of. But underneath it, something else is taking place. Healing does not announce itself loudly inside a narcissistic dynamic. It registers as absence. You respond a little later than you used to. You explain yourself less. You no longer rush to repair tension that you didn't create. The change is subtle, but to someone who has relied on your emotional availability as a stabilizing force, it is unmistakable. From the outside, narcissistic punishment is often misunderstood as retaliation for disobedience or defiance. But internally, it is not triggered by rebellion. It is triggered by loss of access. Healing threatens the narcissistic structure not because it is confrontational, but because it is self-contained. It removes you from the role you were never told you were playing. Regulator, mirror, emotional shock absorber. For a long time, the relationship may have felt intense, consuming, even intimate in a way that was hard to articulate. That intensity was not accidental. It was the byproduct of a system designed to bind your emotional state to theirs. When you felt close, it was because you were aligned. When you felt anxious, it was because alignment was at risk. Over time, your nervous system learned that safety depended on monitoring their moods, anticipating their reactions, staying just close enough to be useful, but not so close that you became threatening. Healing begins when that monitoring starts to fail. Not because you stop caring in a dramatic sense, but because your internal world starts to take up more space. You think your own thoughts without immediately filtering them through how they might land. You notice discomfort without rushing to neutralize it. You tolerate silence. These are not acts of rebellion, they are acts of return. And they are deeply destabilizing to someone who experiences closeness not as connection, but as control. Narcissistic punishment rarely arrives all at once. It unfolds in phases, often masked as misunderstanding, concern, or disappointment. At first, there may be confusion on their end, expressed as irritation or unease they cannot quite name. You feel it as a subtle shift in tone, a tightening. Conversations that once flowed now feel slightly off balance. You may sense that you are being observed more closely, as if something about you needs to be corrected. This is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition beginning to surface. When a narcissistic system detects loss of influence, it attempts recalibration. Small tests appear. Emotional bids are intensified or withdrawn to see if you will respond as before. The warmth that once felt unconditional becomes conditional again, though it may have always been. Praise is replaced with critique, affection with ambiguity. If you lean in, the system stabilizes. If you don't, escalation follows. What makes this particularly disorienting is that the punishment does not always look like aggression. Sometimes it looks like distance, or martyrdom, or a sudden portrayal of themselves as wounded by your change. You may be told that you are different, cold, or not yourself lately. The implication is subtle, but clear. The version of you that caused no friction is the version that was acceptable. Internally, this can reactivate old confusion. Healing does not erase conditioning overnight. Even as you feel yourself stabilizing, you may find doubt creeping in. Am I being unfair? Am I abandoning something? Am I becoming selfish? These questions are not signs that you are regressing. They are echoes of a reality where your value was measured by your responsiveness to someone else's needs. The narcissistic dynamic depends on a distorted sense of responsibility. You were never explicitly told that their emotional equilibrium depended on you, but it was implied through consequence. When they felt good, things were calm. When they felt threatened, you paid. Over time, Your system learned to associate your own regulation with their approval. Healing disrupts that association. As that disruption becomes more pronounced, punishment becomes more targeted. It may take the form of withdrawal designed to provoke pursuit, or sudden criticism meant to destabilize your growing sense of self, or revisionist storytelling, where your past contributions are minimized and your current boundaries reframed as betrayals. None of this is random. It is an attempt to reassert narrative control. One of the most destabilizing aspects of this phase is the return of reality distortion. You may notice conversations looping without resolution. Facts are reinterpreted. Intentions are assigned to you that do not match your internal experience. When you attempt to clarify, the clarification itself becomes evidence against you. The goal is not understanding. It is destabilization. For someone healing, this can feel like being pulled back into a fog you thought you had escaped. Your clarity wavers. The calm you were beginning to trust feels fragile again. This is often the point where punishment intensifies, because your internal steadiness represents a threat. Not because you are attacking, but because you are no longer available in the same way. Narcissistic punishment is less about causing pain and more about restoring hierarchy. The system requires you to occupy a lower psychological position, one where your internal world is secondary. Healing elevates you out of that position without asking permission. The response is an attempt to push you back down, often by triggering the very self-doubt that once kept you compliant. It is important to understand that this punishment is not strategic in a calculated sense. It is reactive. The narcissistic structure experiences your healing as abandonment, even if you are physically present. It registers your emotional autonomy as rejection. And because the system cannot tolerate responsibility for its own instability, that rejection must be punished. As this unfolds, you may notice a strange inversion. The more grounded you become, the more chaotic the dynamic feels. The calm you carry internally contrasts sharply with the tension being generated around you. This contrast can be unsettling. It can make you question whether your steadiness is real or whether you are missing something important. But what is actually happening is exposure. Healing removes the buffer that once absorbed dysfunction. Without your constant regulation, the underlying instability becomes visible. Not just to you, but to the system itself. And visibility is intolerable to a structure built on denial. By the end of this phase, there is often no dramatic break, just a deeper clarity. You begin to see patterns not as isolated incidents, but as a coherent response to your change. The punishment no longer feels personal in the way it once did. It feels structural. And that realization, while quiet, is irreversible. As the dynamic continues to shift, the system does not adapt gracefully. It strains. The loss of control does not register as a lesson to be learned, but as a threat to be neutralized. Internally, what emerges is not sadness so much as panic. A diffuse, unnameable sense that something essential is slipping away. From the outside, the narcissist may appear composed, functional, even confident. But internally, the absence of your previous responsiveness creates a vacuum. The emotional supply that once stabilized their sense of self is no longer reliable. This destabilization is rarely acknowledged directly. Instead, it is managed through projection. You may notice accusations intensifying. Traits they cannot tolerate in themselves are suddenly identified in you. You are described as selfish, ungrateful, or detached. The irony is that these accusations often mirror the very autonomy you are developing. What they label as cruelty is your neutrality. What they call abandonment is your self-containment. This projection serves a dual purpose. It externalizes their discomfort, and it attempts to provoke you back into engagement. If you defend yourself, explain, or argue, the system reactivates. Control is reestablished, even temporarily. If you remain steady, the projection escalates or collapses inward. In some cases, this collapse takes the form of rage. Not always explosive, but sharp, cutting, and destabilizing. The rage is not about you. It is about the sudden confrontation with an internal emptiness that can no longer be outsourced. Healing removes your role as emotional regulator, and the system has no internal replacement. In other cases, the response is feigned superiority, a sudden dismissal of your importance, a narrative where they were never invested, never affected, never dependent. This false elevation is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement, often through new sources of attention or validation. New supply is not about connection. It is about containment. What becomes increasingly clear during this phase is the contrast between image and reality. Externally, the narcissist may appear to be thriving, socially active, productive, unbothered. Internally, however, the destabilization continues. The absence of genuine regulation leads to cycles of grandiosity and depletion. Highs followed by crashes. Confidence followed by emptiness. At the same time, something quieter is happening within you. Without force, without declaration, your internal alignment begins to settle. The need to be understood by them diminishes. Not because you have given up, but because understanding is no longer required for your stability. You begin to experience yourself as a separate psychological entity, not an extension of someone else's needs. This shift is not euphoric. It is grounded. There is still grief, still confusion at times, but there is also a growing consistency. Your emotions make sense to you again. Your reactions feel proportionate. You are no longer constantly scanning for threat or approval. This internal sovereignty is not announced. It is lived. The narcissistic system continues to respond to this sovereignty as provocation. Smear campaigns may emerge, subtle or overt. Your character is reframed to preserve their narrative. This is not about convincing others as much as it is about convincing themselves. If you are flawed, their loss of control is justified. What is often misunderstood is that these behaviors are not signs of strength. They are signs of structural weakness. A system that cannot tolerate separation must pathologize it. A self that cannot self-regulate must externalize blame. None of this requires your participation. As time passes, the punishment loses its potency, not because it stops, but because it no longer lands in the same place. The hooks that once caught are no longer embedded. The silence, the accusations, the withdrawal, they register, but they do not destabilize your core. This is where the idea of consequence becomes relevant, not as revenge, but as inevitability. A system built on extraction cannot survive without access. When access is removed, collapse is not dramatic. It is quiet, repetitive, cyclical. The same patterns played out with diminishing returns. For you, the consequence is different. It is not triumph. It is clarity. You see the dynamic without needing to resolve it. You understand the punishment without internalizing it. The need to prove your reality fades because your reality is no longer dependent on their recognition. By the end of this psychological arc, there is no final confrontation, no moment of victory, just a settled understanding. Healing was never an attack. It was a return. And the punishment was never about justice. It was about loss. What remains is a quiet authority, not over them, but within yourself. An internal order restored. The system that once felt all-encompassing now appears finite, contained by its own limitations. And you, no longer organized around it, continue forward. Not in defiance, but in alignment.